Hello and welcome to another perfectly imperfect conversation for the Flourishing Education podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my new guest, Dr. Jordan Maynard. Very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabienne. This is an honor to be here.
Yeah, well, the honor is all mine to be holding space for you today, so welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Um, so for the listeners, I have had a previous conversation with Jordan. So we know each other a little bit, but
Mhm.
to help the people who are listening to this conversation, I wonder if we could start where I always start with my guests, which is, you know, who is Jordan? So who are you? Where are you in the world? And what has been your journey
Mm.
in education so far?
Okay, it feels like a big question. But yeah, Fabienne and I have met virtually through our university. We've had this conversation before because I had major podcast nerves and wanted to work out what on earth she was after. But I've become a huge believer in the project that you're running, Fabienne. So thank you for giving me and my research a platform. And I'm excited to see what we end up talking about today and who's going to be listening. And hopefully, this will be useful for anyone listening. My research comes from over a decade of practice knowledge beforehand. So I came into academia with a very kind of explicit sort of political drive for my work. I wanted my work to be based in activism, to be useful, and to be a safe space for the young people that I work with. So previous to coming to university, I worked in schools with Gypsy, Roma, and traveller young people, um, and just realised that there were huge gaps in the knowledge that we as educators bring to our practice, in research knowledge, and just in a there's a lack of a bridge of not just understanding but respect as well, towards these communities. And um, yeah, I feel very privileged to occupy a space where I feel I can be a bit of a bridge, and so that's what my research kind of intends to be. Um, so I passed my Viva in March.
Yay,
Um,
congrats!
yeah. So this is all fresh, and this is the first time I've spoken about my research since then. So it's exciting to be able to share it and to say that it's going to be available for anyone to read after next week. It will be published on our university's portal, and I'm going to find other ways of making this available because I think it's going to be really useful for educators, teachers, researchers, and youth workers alike. Um, so yes, that's I think. Oh, I'm in Somerset. If anyone is interested to know, I love it here. You'll probably be able to tell by a slight twang in my accent. It's becoming thicker as the years go by, and I do not mind it at all. Um, so yeah, that's me. Um,
Amazing, thank you. So, I wonder whether, because I'm a linguist at heart,
mhm.
whether we could start with you said about like bridging
Mm.
and building bridges and stuff in our understanding. So could we start with maybe a I'm sure I like what the word definition because it feels so defining, like so
Mhm.
set, right? But a describer or how would you describe the the population the participants,
Yeah,
because
that's
those words like traveling communities, Romani gypsy, all of those things.
mm.
I sometimes feels like until we have shared sort of common language, it makes it really difficult to know that we're talking about the same thing. So could we like linger here and stay here a little bit?
I think that's so important, and it's something I always like to start with when I'm having conversations with people um, about their practice relating to the communities. So there's this umbrella term, Gypsy Roma Traveller, which is often abbreviated to just GRT. It's a legal definition in the UK. And it defines two major groups of people. So let's imagine that umbrella separates into two. And under one umbrella, you have ethnic minority groups. And under another umbrella, you have non-ethnic minority groups who are all, you know, meant to be described under this one umbrella term. I want to say, first of all, that I find this problematic. I think it's quite essentializing. And I really hope that we move towards better definitions in the future. But at the moment, I sit in a place where I use it because it's the legal definition and because it's the terms that research uses, but I use it hesitantly because I don't think it captures the myriad of different peoples who are described under it, and I don't think that's fair. So we'll start with that. So we've got these two umbrellas. I have pretty much exclusively worked with the under umbrella of ethnic minorities in the Gypsy Roma and Traveller grouping. So that includes Irish travellers, Welsh travellers, English Romany gypsies, Roma, who have migrated from Eastern Europe to the UK, and all across actually the world, some from Chile, some from Greece. You know, there's a huge diversity of people here, but the things that they share in common are a history of nomadism. Now, again, this is an interesting one because I think a lot of people assume that every single person described under this umbrella term has at some point lived in a caravan or a vado and sat around a fire. And some of those assumptions would be correct for some of those groupings, but I just want to be clear again that the nomadism has not always been a choice for these groups. So let's start with the Roma. It's another umbrella term. There's many under this, but Roma originated in northern India and have moved all the way across the globe over hundreds and hundreds of years, and various groupings settled in particularly Eastern Europe. And through that traveling, their language evolved, their cultures evolved. And we know that they were in England, in the UK, as early as the 1500s. So they've been here a very, very long time. Although a lot of the Roma groups that I've worked with only recently migrated to England from other Eastern European countries. But some of their nomadism was forced by slavery, by empire. So although they made beautiful traditions out of the ways that they moved in their family groups, it was not always a choice. So I think that's important to say as well. Same for Irish travellers. Nomadism is a huge part of their culture, and it's largely to do with family commitments, their jobs, what's needed when. It's kind of seasonal work. A lot of people do choose to be nomadic still, and some people choose to be settled. And if they choose to be settled and they are housed, they're still an Irish traveller because that is their ethnic identity. So there we go. But then in the non-ethnic group, I'll just mention this briefly. That covers anyone who kind of travels or lives nomadically for either work reasons or lifestyle choice. So we tend to call these people new age travelers or new travelers. But it also includes people like show people, people who work in circuses or have jobs that, again, seasonal and require them to move around a lot. And the other thing that these groups share in common is a rich history of discrimination. You know, the kind of first mentions we have of Roma communities in the UK, as far back as the 1500s, are the governments, the kings, reactions to them and immediately legislating them and making sure that they are populations that are controlled in some way, regulated, or even made illegal. So that's one of the things that, you know, if you're working in research with Gypsy, Roma, and traveller communities, you'll know that that's something that unfortunately they've shared in common for a long, long time. And on that note, I might just mention the word gypsy because, again, it's another problematic term that's, I'm sure a lot of people will be listening and going, oh, can you say that? And I think it's important to address. It's another term that originates from the first movement of Roma peoples to England. And because of their brown skin, people assumed they were Egyptian. And that's the root of the word. So it was a derogatory term to describe them that was kind of forced on them. But now what we're finding is that a lot of communities under the Gypsy Roma Traveller umbrella self-ascribe as Gypsy in England. That isn't the case in America. In America, it's known as a term that's derogatory, and in the UK, it's something that people will self-ascribe as. So as long as communities self-ascribe and are happy for me to identify them as Gypsy, then I will. But again, I use that term with caution. And if anyone's wondering whether it's okay for them to use that term, I would just always say, just ask the person how they would like to describe themselves. And you can't go wrong then by responding to what they request. Um, so I'm really glad you asked me about the terms because, as you can see, there's a lot of tension in them. I like to think that, you know, we're always constantly learning and adapting our practice. I think that's really important. So I don't use these terms with, you know, great authority or kind of a definitive uh, way about them. I think we have to hold them lightly and respond to the moment and to the people that we're with. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Completely, and
Okay.
gosh, I just like there's so much like in the richness of
Yeah.
what you've described. So my first thought is when I heard this is a real like diaspora of,
Mm,
you know, how whilst you were describing the visuals for me was so like vibrant, right? Like so important it is to recognize that um so that like the vibrancy and the diaspora whilst also thinking as because I've got my research and what I'm reading in the back of my mind, how our Western ways of uh, thinking, doing, and being, and in particular in terms of research, so both our ontological and epistemological approaches, means that actually, to the contrary, we like to slot people into labels, right? So as you were speaking, I'm like, oh, already I can feel like this contention between, you know, and I'm reading this beautiful article by Dr. Damas in who's based in Quebec. And he, in his article, is talking specifically about regenerative and restorative pedagogy, and how he talks about in the abstract. I've got it just here, like this idea of how the neoliberal approach to hegemonic education um, has a tendency, and I read here, which contributes to destroying knowledge, so epistemicide, identities, identicize, cultures, ethnocide, ethnic groups, genocide, and then natural environment, ecocide, and then animals, zoocide. And so as you were
mm,
speaking, I'm like, oh wow, like what you're describing feels like, you know, and then you said like the 1500s, right? Like way
mm.
back already, which then leads to like enlightenment and, you know, all of those periods. So I don't know. I wonder whether that like we could again linger here a
Yeah.
bit longer.
Yeah. That the abstract you know you've just taken from that just sounds fascinating and I think it does really intersect with this work. I think your mention of education being quite uh, yeah, the way that we in the Western world place our expectations and our knowledge as being above and being correct and being the only way perfectly describes how we have a system that expects people to integrate rather than be accommodated. And I think that's where my research began, where I started speaking to teachers about what they understood about their traveller students and what they understood about inclusion policy. And I think I just realised that they had no knowledge of the cultural wealth of these communities, um, and saw the ways that the traveller families in their schools were interacting with school as being a deficit rather than um, an asset. Um, and and it was kind of this application of expectation on them that they must conform to this in order for their children to succeed. And I thought, oh, I think this might be completely the wrong way around. So then my next phase of research, this was for my master's, I then went to the young people and I said, well, who are you? How do you see yourself represented in the world? And what things do you want to share about your lives and cultures? And we did that through literature. We did it through the creation of books, which depicted and celebrated aspects of their lives that they hadn't seen in children's literature before. But throughout that research, the thing that I did not expect to record and to see was the way that creating a space in which young people could express their cultural identities and celebrate them was a real challenge in a school environment. So, you're in an institution and you're practicing a pedagogy that does not fit the norm. Things like I'm not correcting spelling, I'm not funneling their learning into, oh, I see you understand this, how about this? I'm not directing, I'm facilitating. And I found that there was a lot of tension in what I was doing and in the expectations of the institution on what these young people were doing. So I thought, oh, there's something here in this space. And so for my PhD, I knew that space was going to be quite key. And so I asked a lot of questions about what spaces Gypsy, Roma, and traveller young people are allowed to occupy in our communities, and where they're welcomed, where they're not welcomed, and why, and where do they feel safe, and where can they express themselves, and how can we create a space then together where they can share their cultural knowledge and their wealth, and where they can imagine different outcomes and challenge this narrative about them, which is constantly about a deficit. I call it the deficit narrative. So if you do a quick Google Scholar search, let's say, other platforms are available, and just put in, Gypsy, Roma, traveller young people in education, I can guarantee you that most of the papers that will come up first will be about poor outcomes. They'll be about low attendance. They'll be about low aspirations, not attending higher education. So you can see over time this narrative, and in the news as well, in media, it's they don't do this, they can't do that, da, da, da. And we're again applying our westernized framework on these young people and just not even questioning it. And so I wanted to ask, what happens when you create a space with these young people in which they get to facilitate this narrative, they get to say what they want to say and challenge those deficit narratives about them. So that's where this research began, and it's as I said, like explicitly activist. It's about going against the tide of what we have done previously in education and in legislation and in kind of every aspect of life for Gypsy, Roma, and traveller young people in England. There's documentation just making quite clear how they're disadvantaged and neglected. But I just want to make clear that it's not because they don't have the capacity and the power. It's because we apply this framework of understanding, which, as you said, is a side of sorts, you know?
Yeah, and you know, like even the words we use, like being
Mm,
disadvantaged, well, is it because they're actually underserved, right? Like what I'm
hmm
hearing in what you're sharing is that, so I mean there's so many echoes of like what you're with my research, because I'm all about like spaces, like co-creating space
mm,
together. um and I'm really curious, and then I would love you to say to tell us what actually happens, but for now, like again, if we just sort of pause here to discuss this particular bit, is what I heard is in what you shared is how, so as a psychologist, I was sort of like social psychologist, I was hearing you speak and I'm thinking, oh, isn't it interesting? There's automatically an othering, right? Like there's is them and us.
yeah.
And in that, there's also like things that we haven't discussed, but that is there in that other. And is the traveling bit, right? Like the traveling bit, which for us settlers is very foreign to what the norm says we need to do, right? There's that one. And then there's also in what you shared, which has been my experience as a recovering language teacher who was forced to home educate, this also unspoken that you should be in school
Mm,
because we've created schools and education to, you know, it's also the underspoken cultural narrative that functionality of education, that there is meritocracy and that you
mm,
have to work hard to succeed, right? And if you don't, it's your choice, all of those things. So,
mm,
and I'm hearing you speak, which is like echoing my experience of my talking circle. So that's why I'd love us to sort of linger here. It's
mm,
almost like we making the culture visible in a way that actually in how we speak, or that deficit narrative, it's invisible. So it's almost like you and I are breathing life into like the
mm,
messy, complex,
mm.
cultural sort of like hidden iceberg. Does that feel true to you?
Yeah, and I think as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the privilege it is that we have the time and the space to unpick our own assumptions. And I think you have to start anti-racist practice with that, with understanding that the way we process and view communities that have been painted as others is just all based on our own understandings that have been fed to us in our own cultures. And I was thinking about space, and I can touch on this, you know, with direct relation to Gypsy, Roma, and traveling communities in general, actually. One of the first things that was legislated against them when they arrived in this country was about space. It's always been about space. And up until now, you know, I think it was, I really don't want to get the date wrong, but we've had this recent Police Crime and Sentencing Courts Act, which is criminalizing nomadism. It's stopping people who are still choosing to be nomadic from pitching up on unauthorized encampments. It's criminalizing it to the point where all of their possessions can be taken from them. They can face prison sentences. So we've got to this extreme point now where that whole lifestyle is being made criminal. But it's been a very slow and steady movement, you know, all throughout the history that we know in this country, to erase common grounds, to erase stopping places that are places where they can go and congregate and share lives and resources, and where they can work together and where they meet with their families. Um, so that's been, you know, a very obvious to me picture of how generally in this culture we try and erase difference. Um, and in schooling, it's similar. You know, we don't value different cultural knowledges, and if somebody doesn't fit in the kind of stencil of what we view as success, then they are the deficit, not us. And so I think you really have to unpick your assumptions before you come into research like this, and even then you'll continue to be challenged. And I learned a lot about cultural humility and really challenging my own ways of viewing the outcomes of my research. There was one point where I felt like what we were doing wasn't succeeding, and I had to reflect, and I
Oh
had
my gosh,
to
I resonate so much.
really.
Well, that's the conditioning, right? Because you have to find magic solutions. So, of course,
Yeah.
right?
So I was sitting there going, oh, it's just, this isn't working. And, you know, perhaps I thought something, you know, really grand and fabulous would come from these sessions, or that what I was saying wasn't having an impact and blah, blah, blah. And then through this deep critical reflection, which I was committed to in my research, um, I came to the conclusion that I was the one misreading what was happening. And that formed one of the biggest concepts from my thesis, which, you know, I then learned from the young people, which is the whole point of creating a space in which you're equals and you learn from each other. Um, and had I not, you know, properly questioned my own positioning there, that wouldn't have happened. So I think it's really important, if you're an educator or a researcher or anyone working with these communities, that you just question your own assumptions immediately, um and that's a good starting point, but we have to continue that practice, I think.
There's so richness in what you've shared already, already. So, a couple of things that I just want to sort of like mention, and then we sort of see where we want to go. The first thing is,
Yeah.
I think I resonate with what you're saying about like the anti-racist. So it made
Mm.
me think of Badenhorst and their article. I don't know if you're familiar with what they've written, but they wrote an article around predatory white anti-racism. And in there, they talk about how if you want to be doing anti-racist work and social justice work, you need to do soulful justice work. So, like the inner.
Mm.
And so, what
Yeah.
you're describing is like almost like the looking at and then he echoes Aunt Vanessa Andreotti's words on like we've all been neurocolonized, right? Like how we've all been trained to think through the schooling and the socializing in the culture. Um,
Yeah.
so that those were the first things. So like almost like the what Vanessa Andreotti says is like we have to neuro decolonize in that way.
Mm.
Um, and then I was struck because I was thinking, actually, maybe we should linger here a little bit around that anti-racist word, because I'm
Mm.
not sure people in England or Britain, and I would argue in Europe for that matter, because I'm also like I lived in France and I lived in Spain, view the way we look at Gypsy Roma travelers or traveling communities as racism. So
Mm.
can we actually link, like, stay here a bit longer and address
Mm.
that? Because in that, I think also what I heard, which is echoing my experience with my research, is a word that emerged, which is fear. I wonder
Mm.
how much with that othering fear plays such a big role. So what you were saying about how we now criminalizing the
Mm.
nomadic ways of being of these people. So I don't know, like that. Those are my feelings as I'm hearing you speak. I would
Yeah.
love us to linger here.
Yeah, I think that's really important. One of the questions I address in my thesis is it really racism? Because I've had this conversation with so many practitioners, and I think yes, we do have to answer that. So first of all, the communities I've worked with are defined as an ethnic minority. So they are protected under the Race Relations Amendment Act of 2000. That in itself should be enough reason for us to then interpret any discrimination against them as racism. That's a legal framework that we are, bound by somewhat. Um, but the other thing that I talked about is, um, again, just going back to the histories and colonization and the exclusion and vilification that they've experienced are very, very comparable to other minority groups who've experienced racism. So I have no problems with naming it as that, but I agree that there are probably people who don't think of it in that way because um, Irish traveller communities, for example, are white. They speak English. They do have dialects that are different to English, um, but they present as white. But there's some really interesting studies that kind of just nail it on the head. And I wish I could quote who it is. You'll have to. I will find the references if you want them.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
they
yeah.
talk about this unacceptable form of whiteness
Mm.
that we see, and these communities are um, not accepted as being white and English by white and English people. So they are experiencing racism. I think the evidence is clear enough if you want to go there. Um, but I also think it's important to not compare too closely with other ethnic minority groups
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
is
yeah.
different if you
Yeah,
have
yeah, 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 yeah.
white
And
skin and
yes,
you
yes.
speak English. We're not going to essentialize, but at the same
No,
time, I think
yeah, yeah.
there's plenty that justifies it. And yeah, I think a lot of people would be shocked to know that people who are identify as Gypsy, Roma, or Traveller are protected ethnic minority under law.
Mm. And isn't it ironic, right? Like, because we've
Mm,
actually created laws to protect, and yet
mm.
we're discriminating. So to me, it sounds like
Yes.
completely crazy.
Yeah, and you'd be shocked in 2026 what is still acceptable, in casual conversation, but also in very explicit and professional situations as well. During my research, I walked past a corner shop in Bristol that had a sign on the door saying "No Roma allowed." And you would just
Uh,
you think, am I in the 1950s? Like, what is happening here? And obviously it was reported to the police and dealt with, but um people don't think
mm,
that they're being
mm,
racist. And
mm,
again, obviously there's so much racism still to deal with in this country. I'm not saying that we've got better in every level we should have, but this is something that is still a big taboo and not spoken about explicitly enough, in my opinion. I didn't come into this research naive, but I was still shocked by what I witnessed. Um, and and I write about that in my thesis as well. You have to acknowledge the structural racism that underpins these young people's experiences in education. And I witnessed firsthand multiple instances where I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And that's from a privileged position of an adult white non-traveler researcher. And so, how that affects the young people that I was working with is beyond belief. So yeah, it's potentially very depressing. Um and it has to be spoken about and it has to
mm,
be questioned. And I do see more um, awareness amongst educators in particular, wanting to do the right thing and wanting to support their students. But as you said, I think people feel that these communities are hidden and hard to reach. And I think that's where, as you said, fear is is the main barrier. Because from my experience anyway, if you take the time to listen and to connect, um, then there's nothing hidden. There's nothing hidden there.
No, no.
It's all in the open, and it's pretty beautiful.
Yeah, and I love that because I think for me what I'm hearing is you you've been breathing life right into like what you've been seeing, and that's
Mm,
such a beautiful image, right? Like making visible the invisible and enabling. Because as I hear you speak, I'm thinking, well, also with tech and the way we live and how busy we all are, and how we all building walls, right, to separate ourselves,
mm,
and how we've been asked to be hyper individualistic. That fear, the reality of that fear is it turns us into this human being that needs to protect themselves.
mm,
So, in a way, I'm thinking maybe for a lot of people, if you become this human being that has survival, right? Like it is in survival, then, and you're fearful of the other,
yeah.
then rather than leaning in and being curious, you become really defensive, right?
Mm,
Um, and with obviously in the UK and everywhere else in the world, the rise of like polarization and echo chambers and the inability to have difficult conversations, it sounds to me like your work is really, really important because it does the opposite. It sort of like makes us lean in and call in like my
mm,
I've got two amazing friends and also PGR students, Rose and Alex, who do an R for like decolonial sort of space in the university, and they talk about calling people in, and I love their work. They're just awesome.
mm,
um so I'm hearing that in your work, right? Like how do we all come together and have those difficult conversations? Because what I also heard in what you were sharing is everybody's where they're at in terms of what soulful justice work we all need to do. Does that
mm.
feel true to you?
Yeah, so one of the conclusions I came to in my research was about the inner work that needs to be done. As a researcher or as a youth worker, I worked with an amazing team of youth workers at Learning Partnership West for this research as well. And so they had to engage, we all had to engage in a really reflexive practice, unpicking our assumptions, and we embedded that into our practice. So after every session that we spent with the young people, we would be asking ourselves questions, reflecting on what happened, and making sure that we were responsive to the young people. We worked as facilitators, not leaders. We came from a place of cultural humility. We made sure that we'd informed ourselves before we went into the spaces. And do you know what's really key? And I think a lot of people wouldn't understand or know this because it's so different from our Western cultural norm, is connecting with the whole family is really key.
Mm.
The kinship structures in Gypsy, Roma, and traveller communities are of really high importance. So, one of the settings where I did my research was a traveller site, and we went in intending to work with a very specific age group and a group of young people, and we were going to do X, Y, Z. And then they started meeting with us and bringing their younger siblings and bringing their mammy, and the granddad would come, and we were. This is where we thought, oh, this is a bit chaotic. This isn't what we prepared for. And this is where we had to take time and go, no, we are meeting them in their space where they are. And if they come with the whole family, then that's what we're gonna respond to. And that's really important. So um the recognition of the importance of that kinship structure was key to co-creating that space to make it really safe for them. There were so many benefits to it in the end that we would have
Mm.
really missed if we'd gone, actually, no, we don't take 3-year-olds, and
Yeah.
adults need to leave at X time. It just, again, we were applying our understanding of what successful youth work looked like. And once we'd let go of that, we were really gifted with a different kind of space and input that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So
Mhm.
yeah, I can't remember what you said though, Fabienne.
No, no, but
I'm just really enjoying this conversation.
that's so wonderful. And you know what? I've this week because I've just had a data um collection point, which was mind blowing, and I'm still like
Oh,
just so beautiful. That I've been reading loads around like spaces. And I've been reading in particular of like Omi Baba's sort of like
mm,
third space.
yes,
And as you're speaking, I'm really reminded of that. So
yes.
does
So
that
that's
resonate?
yeah, Homi Bhabha's third space is one of the theories that I used in my theoretical framework. So for my theoretical framework, I synthesized critical race theory, Homi Bhabha's third space theory, and then Freirean critical pedagogy.
Ah,
Um,
okay,
so I
I hear it in what you're
yeah.
sharing.
So
Amazing.
I needed to theorize for critical race theory. That gave me the racialized context of structure and inequality that can't be ignored, and storying as a counter to that. And then third space was about the tension and hybridity and these two cultures clashing and what might happen in that space. And then the critical pedagogy was about, how a researcher or a youth worker and a young person can come together and ask questions and centralize cultural wealth and critical consciousness and then take action. And there needed to be hope. And I find that a lot of Freire's work speaks about hope, um, which I thought was very needed in this space. So yeah, you've nailed it. You heard me and worked it out.
But I've been
Um,
reading, I've been like deep into his work because of
yeah,
what's emerged in my own research. So
yeah, that's
how
great.
timely and fascinating.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, like, because what I heard you sort of describe really is this, where I've been sitting with, because obviously my experience of co-creating on the podcast, right? Like
mhm,
this suddenly sort of like this realization that maybe there are like the third space is that in between space
yeah,
where where really rather than because it's those binaries we've created, right, like this or that, um
yeah,
and then I heard you share like how as you were sharing about the communities, how like it echoes, like the kinship echoes a lot of the work I've been reading around, um well, kinship with like nature. We are nature, right? So to me, there's also like an ontological in what you're sharing. There's an
mm,
ontological. So for the listeners, like how do we view who we are, right? Like our beingness, what's true for us. And
mm,
I'm hearing an encounter of the Western ways of like ontological thinking, which is there's a like post-positivist, there's an object and like almost like cogs in a machine, etc. And then this beautiful culture where it's like, well, it's intergenerational, and there's like they're also almost like the cosmological and the spiritual in that, right? Like that we Westerners have completely gone, through Descartes and Darwin, gone, nah, like that is not part. You separate the head and the body, etc.
mm,
So it's almost like rather than saying it's this or that, right, swinging the pendulum the other way, it sounds to me like you've sat in the messiness of the middle, like Buddha's middle way, right? And
yeah.
co-created together. Does that feel also like,
Oh, absolutely. And one of the phrases I used a lot while in that space was we're embracing the chaos. Um,
amazing?
and that was with my youth workers. It kind of came out after one of our sessions where we'd had 3-year-olds we weren't expecting. We'd had bubbles being blown. It was physical mess, it was noise, it was what I would describe as chaos, in a beautiful way. And we all looked at each other, and this is when I had this feeling of, oh, is this going well? Is this successful? Are we doing what we intended to do here? And but on reflection, I came to the realization that I was applying my framework of understanding of what a successful session looked like onto young people who had their own understanding of what a successful session looked like. And I was the one who needed to bend. And the youth workers and I um, engaged in a lot of reflective conversation about that, and made adaptations. And then we used that phrase, let's embrace the chaos, to challenge ourselves in the moment, to say, no, we respond to the young people and what they are asking for, and what they're expressing agency right in the here and now. And that has worth and value, and we can learn so much from it. And I think it was one of the greatest learnings in a way from my research that I took away, that in order for me to practice anti-racism, I have to practice an unlearning constantly of the minutiae of what I think of as being successful research, of what I think of as being acceptable outputs, and all of those things. And yes, we have to tick certain boxes in academia because that's what's required of us to move forward and to quote unquote succeed. But you can do the learning and you can do the work, and that is of worth and it's valuable. um and I think that's what a third space is for as well, to have these, it's about cultural clashes. And I think you're going to find Homi Bhabha's work really helpful for you if that's what you're looking into. um yeah, I loved it and I found it really useful. But just to go back to the politics of space, particularly for the Gypsy Roman traveller community, we ended up naming these spaces as relational stopping places. So stopping places are the traditional places where communities would meet when they were traveling. And they have them all over the UK. Some are marked and some are unmarked, and we won't know about them. But it's where families would meet and share stories and share resources, and maybe they'd meet and then move on to the next jobs or whatever it was. And these spaces have been erased over time, either through, physical fences. We have anti-traveller architecture in my village in particular. They've made sure that no one can get into the local park, and with caravans, and there's all this kind of thing. You'll start to notice it now that you've heard the term anti-traveller architecture. It could be a boulder, it could be a log, but it's there to stop people accessing that
Mm-hmm.
space.
Mm-hmm.
So we named these spaces we co-created as relational stopping places, in recognition of the erasure of these physical spaces and the need for young people in particular in these communities to have somewhere where they're free to express themselves and carry on their traditions. And in lots of ways, we weren't facilitators, we were observers. And there were moments where we, myself as a researcher and the youth workers, had to use our power in terms of the way that we gained access to space through institutions, the way we fought for those spaces, the way we funded the work. So we use our power on that side of things. But when we're in the room, we were very much kind of lifting up the young people as much as possible, and giving them authority to make choices and decisions and take action on things that they wanted to. And it was really amazing, because when I'd undone those expectations somewhat, I think that's an ongoing work. I got to see these young people step up and really express themselves and create things that were beautiful and important to them. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I hope you have that experience in your research too,
Yeah, well,
Fabienne.
that's what I'm seeing, so for sure. So that was one
Yeah.
of my questions for you, is that actually, um, like, so literally the adults' reaction to the young people sharing was they was just literally blown away. That's what they said. Um, and so I wonder whether you could share a little bit about what was the experiences of the young people who were part of your project, right? Because my experience of a very naively, was it naive or was it actually um, the opposite of humility that you described? But I came into my project thinking, oh, what I'm doing is part, and what I'm doing is
Mm.
like this. And now I use Penn Williams words, which is like participatory spirit,
Okay.
and very sort of like so much more humble because my project is so tiny and so like but it's this real like actually also realizing that because of the systemic, it's very difficult to actually give or co-create true spaces where those young people's voices are truly heard, right? Because
Yeah,
it's so counter cultural.
yeah,
So could you tell us a little bit about like the experiences of the young people?
yeah, yeah. I'll run through like a brief description of the whole thing because I realized I haven't done that yet. So um after I'm going to mention this too because it's important. After a number of years of advocacy and applying for funding and really fighting for our place to do it, myself and three youth workers established two of these groups. One was on a traveller site that was owned by the council, and then the other was in a secondary school that had really high intake of Roma young people. So it was an interesting comparison in that we had an institutional context and then the context in which young people were living, although it's still owned by the council. So that's in itself an institution. So we set up these groups and I met with them weekly for 7 months. In each group, we had 15 to 30 young people attend of their own free will. They could come and go as they pleased. They could share their data as and when they pleased. Um, and the idea, the kind of backbone, the framework of the type of youth work we were doing was a bit like PARS. The framework is called PEER. Um, and it's all about um, encouraging young people to identify issues that are important to them or affect them or people they know and love, learning to take action and then reflecting and continuing that cycle over and over with the view to those actions becoming larger and to creating audiences for those actions too. So um, if I just speed up a description of the groups, one group decided that they really passionate about homelessness in Bristol and they wanted to raise money for a homeless charity. So they organised and carried out an art exhibition at a local community centre, which had previously excluded them from its building.
Wow.
And they invited their teachers, their families, they sold products that they'd made, they took photographs and exhibited them. It was just the most beautiful event. I just still get goosebumps and
Mm.
large emotional feelings about it because these young um people did not have high expectations of their capacity, their capabilities, and I would say perhaps at the beginning they perhaps believed that about themselves too. And over this period of time where we encouraged them to use their own power, to have a voice. Um, and as they exercised that, they grew in it. And there's nothing about giving voice in these spaces. It's all about facilitating action and just saying, as an adult, I'm here. I will help you find the resources. I will connect you to the right people. I will help you develop the skills you need. But this is all you. And over cycles of doing that, the confidence grows, um, and it's just beautiful. So one group did this exhibition, and the other group on the traveller site hosted their own Christmas party, and that's what they wanted and what they needed. And again, it was about taking up space. which they'd been excluded from previously. It was
Mm,
about owning that space. They decorated the room,
mm.
they filled it with things that brought them joy. There was a karaoke machine, there was food, it was,
I
and
love
that's,
it.
yeah, and that's what they wanted and what they mattered to them.
Mm,
And this
mm,
again challenged my expectations of what I thought a successful group would look like, because I'd had ideas about other things they could be doing that were perhaps more political, or had a larger audience. But I got challenged in that because I realized that their values were different to mine,
mm.
that I was again applying my own framework of understanding success, and actually listening to and taking on what they wanted was the priority. And in doing that, they exercised agency and they showed us what they valued, which was family, celebration, joy, dance, music, food, and connection. And that was just really, really lovely. So that those two events were the conclusion to my research. And I went and took kind of all my data home. And I had a baby 2 weeks later.
Wow.
Yeah. Slightly unexpected because he came very early, but unfortunately that was, in a way, unfortunately that was the conclusion of the research. I would have loved to have gone back and had another session with the young people to get their feedback and to talk about what happened and how they felt and how they were moving on. But COVID hit and we
Yeah.
weren't able to meet.
Life
um
happens, right?
yes, yes. But I would like to say this is, one of my greatest joys, is that these groups are still continuing.
Oh, wow.
um yeah, because I partnered with Learning Partnership West, they've continued and replicated that work across multiple other settings. So Bristol City Council have got an amazing Gypsy, Roma and Traveller support team, and they've helped facilitate that too. So I didn't go in, start it and leave, or I did, but it's continued beyond me,
Mm,
which I think is really
mm.
important.
It's
um
legacy work, which is
yeah,
like it. I love that. That's such a beautiful.
yeah.
Wow. Is there a question I haven't asked you that you're thinking, oh, I so wish Fabian had asked me that?
No, I don't think so. I think I think all I'd want to say, because I do think it's important that anyone listening who is interested or resonates with any of it and just wants to know more, that they have a way of contacting me. It's not a personal plug. I'm genuinely really passionate about this work, and I want it to be accessible and useful. So I'm just going to say that my thesis will be available to the public next week on the
Right.
university's
Well, then
website.
if you send me the link, we can put it as
Of course.
as a link
Yeah,
on the podcast, and people can then access it.
yeah.
And
And
then
I
if it
love being
goes,
contacted by
yeah,
people with questions, with
great,
requests for support.
amazing.
I love connecting people with services that can help them. So yes, I my email is an open door. Um
Mm,
so if anyone has questions that they want to ask, please do contact me.
amazing, that's wonderful. So that takes me to a question I ask all of my guests when we get
Yeah.
towards the end of the podcast, which is, you know, on this imperfectly perfect meandering together, is there anything that you want to leave us with and or that you are taking from this conversation?
Just that I think the connection between educators, advocates, allies, researchers is so important. We can't underestimate that. That's something I think I've really learned from the communities that I've worked with, that connection and community are so powerful. Um, and I hope that continues for you through your podcast and through any other means. I think we need to support each other in doing good work, whatever that looks like. So thank you for giving me the space to do that a little bit today, and I hope that more connections come from this.
Mm. Yeah, so do I. I do hope that we'll invite people to reach out to you, and I really hope that you and I can stay in touch and
Yeah,
keep chatting.
of course. I'd love that.
But for now, thank you so much, Jordan.
Thank you, Fabienne. It's been a joy. Thank you so much.